once. Okay, it's going. Okay, so let me share my screen as well. Um, where is my... Okay, it's doing that. I'm just making sure it's not... Okay, perfect. So, um, we're going to go through Karl Marx. Um, as you read in the reading guide, I won't spend too much time on his background. He actually starts out as a journalist, not a sociologist. He never called himself a sociologist. That wasn't really a term that was going on. Um, he would describe himself as a journalist and a political economist. Political economy is probably the closest to sociology that was going on at the time. Um, it was really looking at the intersections of politics and the economy. But we don't really get a solid sociology until Durkheim, who comes after Marx. But his stuff is clearly dealing with the social world, and so it makes sense to review him. So we're going to start with the material dialectic. And to get to the material dialectic, like I said, everyone's responding to someone. And Marx, in this case, is responding specifically to Hegel. So let's start with Hegel. So the dialectic is both, and this might get to John Z, why you're struggling with the difference between, is Marx talking about society or is he talking about how we think and process and go through the world? Hegel does both with his dialectic. So it's simultaneously a um, way that society processes ideas, but it's also a strategy of thought.
Mhm.
So we're going to stick on focusing on his way of thinking about society. And if people, once I'm done with the lecture, if you want to, like, how does this apply to, the individual, let me know. But so his dialectic was that all communities have a specific perception of reality. Um, whether that's like what is the meaning of freedom, what is like, how was the world created, um, the morality of our interactions, whatever the perception is of how the world works and how it should work. That was what Hegel called the thesis. Okay, so the thesis is the perception of reality. However, he was living in a time when most philosophers agreed that you could not actually perceive the reality of the world, that we always view the world through a filter, right? So we can think about, and might be extreme, but think about the politics that are going on right now, and you've got your people who believe in conspiracy theories, right? They are seeing the world through a specific lens of conspiracy theories. It's not reality, but that's what they perceive to be reality. So that would be their thesis, right? And so every human community has their own thesis, which is a lens through seeing the world. But two things could happen to shake up that perception. A, they might experience that reality actually like disrupts that. So maybe their religion was saying, all swans are white, and then they come across the ugly duckling and there's this little black thing and they're like, well, clearly all swans are not white. What do I do with this information? Right? How do I go with this? So they might come in contact with some material real world thing that disrupts their thesis, or they'll come into contact with another human civilization that has a different perception of reality. And so that those perceptions, those theses will be exposed to be flawed or to have some problem. And the thesis with the antithesis will be negotiated in some way. They have to reconcile the fact that there are two different ways of perceiving the world. Or if it's an issue with reality, they'll have to grapple with the fact that, well, Bob told me that all swans are white, but clearly all swans are not white because I see this black swan. So what do I do with that information? What is reality? Is there any question on this, the thesis and antithesis? Okay, so once there's a result from this conflict, Hegel calls it the synthesis. Um, but the synthesis is simply a new perception of the world, right? It's a new thesis. And you see in this little graphic, you have the thesis, there's a flawed idea, and once like the antithesis shows that flaw, and then there's some synthesis of that, and it comes out with a new thesis, right? And so then maybe you have those two societies came together, created a new religion, but look, here's a third society coming over and that has a whole new idea of the world. And they have to keep going through this iteration. And so this is a repeated process until the entire world, it has to be global, the entire world comes to a consensus of how the world works. And so there's no longer any conflict between people and their perceptions of reality. This is what he calls the absolute spirit. It's the state of global consensus of what reality is. And he's not saying that it is real. He's just saying that the perception of reality is agreed upon. Any questions on that?
Yes.
Yeah.
So can okay, how do I want to ask this? So can you have multiple dialectic progressions within the same group? Like what the way I'm thinking about it is really with black and white people in this country and the different iterations. If I think about it the way you just explained it, I can think about all of these different iterations that we've gone through over the century, right? Is
Yeah.
that how you're saying? And you can do that even within the same group. You don't have to
Yeah.
have necessarily another group coming in. I mean, we do all the time, but
Yeah.
this thing keeps going like
Yeah.
that. And do you ever think it's gonna ever quit? Like
So
ever stop?
Hegel does. Hegel believes there's an end. He
Oh,
believes
thank
eventually
God.
there will be conflict until there becomes consensus. Now, he and Marx are probably the last people who are any optimists. So that we will read about. So both Marx and Hegel believed there was an end to conflict.
They
And
both
so,
believe there's an end to it.
yeah. So Marx's end to conflict is communism.
Uh,
The absolute spirit for Marx is communism. Um, and when we discuss what Marx means by communism, we'll see that in no way has Marx's communism ever been achieved on this earth, right? Russian and Chinese communism is a vastly different thing than what Marx was arguing. So when we talk about communism in the class, we have to make sure we're talking about Marx, theory of communism, not communism as it has been carried out by various political states. Personally, I don't know. I haven't set on whether there's going to be an end. I'm going to cross my fingers and hope that there's an end. But we will see. But yes, there are many dialectics going on around the world and even within single communities and even on the same issue, right? Because there's never ever just one thesis and one antithesis, right? There's multiple different ways of thinking about the world at a single time. And so if we even think about race right now, there's a lot of different ideas about what race is, how it should be, how it should order the world that are constantly in the, public discourse that's being discussed. And so this is a very simplified version, clearly, of what a dialectic is. So you're right on it that there could be multiple within the same community. Um, that will be harder to define for Marx because he really has grouped all of society into two groups, right? The the haves and the have-nots. But any other questions on Hegel, though? Okay, so let's start out with Marx's critique. I pulled out this quote because I think it's one of the best examples of what Marx is trying to do when he's talking about Hegel. Um, People like to say that Marx took Hegel and flipped him back on his feet, that Hegel was upside down, because as we talked about for Hegel, uh, the progress of society happened through the negotiation and discussion of ideas and theses. Marx is going to say, no, that's not how it happens. It's the negotiation and conflict between material realities. And so he says life is not determined by consciousness, but consciousness by life. So consciousness is the theses, it's Hegel's theses, right? The way we perceive reality. And for Hegel, he was saying that life was determined by the way we perceive reality. But Marx is flipping that and saying, no, the way we perceive reality is based on what's going on in the material world. Does that make sense? Okay.
It makes
So,
sense. I don't know that I agree, but it makes
and
sense.
that is totally fine. And we will see actually next section, Weber's going to go, well, hold on, Marx, you went too far. Maybe it's both, right? So that's how Weber is going to respond to Marx.
Hmm.
So here is a terrible graphic, but unfortunately the best one that I can find that really exemplifies this. Um, it goes through each of the iterations that Marx focuses on. Let me try to blow it up a little bit more. So we start out in primitive societies, um, especially here. One of the ones he focuses on the most is the slaveholder society, where you have the masters and the slaves. At some point, there is a revolution, and we move into feudalism, where you have the baron and the plebeians, right? The lords and the serfs. At some point, there is an antagonism and a revolution. And that is where we get capitalism today, where the bourgeoisie um, are the haves. And we'll talk about this all a little bit more in a second. And by the way, I'm going to put this PowerPoint itself online so you can also play with it a little bit more. Um, but we see here, so these are the different iterations, like the dialectic, and then the absolute spirit is up here in the classless society, right? That's communism. So for what's important here is that and you don't need to know the stage, you don't have to memorize the stages or how they specifically revolted. What you need to know is that the progression of history for Marx is a progression of economic conditions, and each new phase of the economic conditions is brought about by a revolution. And on that, most scholars agree that Marx was pretty correct. Rarely does a new economic system come in without a large revolution of some sort. Now, what Marx is going to say is the biggest difference between the revolutions that we've seen and the revolutions that will happen with communism is that in each of these cases where there was a revolution, it was a revolution of the minority. So in the slaveholding society, it wasn't the slaves that revolted, it was a smaller group of the owners who revolted and ended slavery. Now, clearly, that is not a complex picture, right? There was more to it than that, but that's how Marx is seeing it. In feudalism, you had the lords and the serfs, and what he argues was that there was a small group of the serfs that were the tradesmen, the artisans, and these people started creating the new economy, which now we have as capitalism, and overthrew the aristocracy. And so those tradesmen, the financiers, whatever, they become the bourgeois, and everyone else becomes the proletariat. Now, what he thinks is going to happen for communism is that the entire proletariat, which is going to be the majority of the world, will rise up, and it will be finally the revolution of the majority rather than these small minorities. Okay? So what does it mean then? What should we get from the German ideology? There's a couple things that I want to point out. I'm going to skip what is it to be human until the alienated labor stuff, because he gets more into that then. But what's important is when he asks about what is reality, the answer is the material world, right? Reality is the material world. It is the trees, it is the forests, it is the water, it is the land, it is the soil, right? That is reality. Whereas for many of the philosophers before Marx, reality was all perception, was all the way we see and view the world. So this is a big change from what's going on in philosophy at the time. Society is formed through the negotiations of laboring in the material world, right? We interact, for Marx, on the basis by which we want to labor, to extract materials from the earth, to create, and to produce. So it doesn't necessarily have to be antagonistic, right? It could just be like, hey, Brittany, I need some help mining this coal because I want to, do this really cool new thing. Can you give me some aid, right? That would be a non-antagonistic way in which people cooperate. But the idea is that people cooperate for the purpose of labor and working in the material world. And so society is formed as people start controlling different aspects of the material world and create power structures based on that ownership. Progress then is the revolutions of who owns the material world, right? So every revolution is a shaking up the ownership of the material world, and that is how society progresses through history. Are there any specific questions on these 4 points? Okay. If you're interested and struggling, let me know. I do have in my notes specific quotes for these, and I'm happy to throw them out if you email me and be like, okay, I can't find where Marx talks about, the basic purposes of interaction. Can you send me, where are you looking for that so that I can have a quote? I'm happy to send that to you. So let's move into capitalism and alienation. Here are the key, and I know this actually is a lot, but they're the reason why I want you to learn the terms is because it will help you mentally picture how Marx is thinking capitalism works. Okay, so the means of production are simply the tools by which you produce. And this includes your labor, this includes the materials, and it includes any tools or buildings or anything else that you need. So when we think about, creating glasses, it will be the glass, it will be the plastic and the metal, but it will also be the factories that smelt the metal and forge the glass. I don't know how glasses are made. It will be the people who are involved. It will be the factories that hold all of that, right? So those are the means of production. The modes of production is the basic way that the economy is structured that determines how people interact with the means of production. So for Marx, there's been 4 basic kinds of modes of production. There's been the primitive society, which was like hunter-gatherers. There's been the slave-holding society in which the labor for the means of production was slavery. There was the lords and the serfs, so this is what he calls feudalism, and today we are in capitalism. Okay, so those economic systems are the modes of production. The relations of production are simply the relations between, the laborers, the materials, and the products. And this is what we're going to get into, is that in capitalism there is a specifically designed relation of production between owners, laborers, and materials. And that's what we get into here. So labor, let's start with, labor value. Labor value is pretty simple. It is the amount of labor that is required to go into making a product. So let's say that it took 4 humans working 2 hours each to build these glasses. That would mean the labor value was 8 hours of labor, right? The exchange value is what someone will pay for that object, right? What value does it have on the marketplace? And if you remember watching the video, that's different than use value. So use value is what someone actually gets out of it, but exchange, that's hard to quantify, right? And so we've created a marketplace of money where we can, instead of talking about it in terms of, hey, that's not as useful for me, we just put a price tag on it. And so that's exchange value. Surplus value is then the exchange value minus any of the production costs, the labor value, and like the factory, or like the any costs of upkeep. Basically, the easiest way to think about it is surplus value is exchange value minus labor and production costs. It's profit, right? So surplus value is profit. It's what the company makes. And what Marx identifies with capitalism is that capitalists are incentivized to always increase the surplus value. The surplus value can be used in quite a few ways, right? It could be used to upgrade technology or upgrade facilities, thereby increasing your future surplus value. It could be used as simple profit for the owners. In non-capitalist systems, it could be used to increase everyone's wages, right? But surplus value is the crux of what is rubbing Marx wrong. Because since everyone is looking to increase their surplus value, there are 2 ways of doing it. There's either reducing the cost of producing, whether that's finding cheaper materials, building more efficient machines, whatever. So you could either reduce the cost of production, or you reduce the cost of labor, i.e., reducing wages. At each stage of capitalism, there's going to become a point when the cost of production really can't be lowered, right? You can't smelt gold any more cheaper than you can today. And so the way that capitalists are going to increase their surplus value is reduce wages. Does that make sense? And this is exploitation. So it's the continued reduction of labor value for the purpose of increasing surplus value. Trying to decide if I want to bring this up now or later. I will bring it up now. Okay, so Marx sees capitalists always competing, and it's kind of like a dog eat dog world, in the sense of, if you are ever in like financial difficulty, you put yourself at risk of a larger company buying you out, right? And so you always want to be part of, he doesn't see the search for surplus value necessarily as greed. He sees it as survival, right? Because if you don't have enough surplus value, then the next organization is going to come in, buy you out, and suddenly you're no longer a capitalist, you're a proletariat. So this is the reason why capitalists are continuously exploiting is simple survival for that being on top of the totem pole. Okay. It's really fascinating for me that Marx is one of the sharpest critics of capitalism, but he's kind of fairly nuanced view of the capitalists, right? He's not necessarily blaming them for it. He's blaming the system, which I think is an important part of this. Okay, so inherent in all of this is, as we've discussed, the material world provides the means of subsistence, right? It provides us the food, it provides us the water, it provides us the clothing and the shelter. One of the problems with every economic system up to this point is private property, is when individuals or groups come in and say, I own these means of subsistence, and so if you want to live, you need to work for me. So this is what he foresees as the ending of exploitation is the ending of private property. Because if no one owns the means of subsistence, then there's no one stopping people from subsisting. They can simply go out, get the materials they need to live, and they're fine. Does that make sense? Are there any questions on what any individual term means before I continue? Okay. Oops. So before we get into alienation, this, the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, where he talks about alienation, is the key insight to how he thinks about how the human world works and what it means to be human. So for Marx, he sees the human essence as being productive, creative laborers in the world. I'm going to pause the share because I want to find does this pause my share? If I do this, can you see the sharing anymore? You can. Okay. I think that all that's doing is pausing the recording.
No, it paused. You paused it now. I don't
Yeah,
see
now
it
I
anymore.
pause it. Yeah. Okay. I wanted to find this quote of what it means to be human because I think it's very helpful. Okay. So he says, humans begin to distinguish themselves from animals.
Yeah.
Here, I'll share this. Okay. So this is what I'm reading is right here. Humans begin to distinguish themselves from animals as soon as they begin to produce their means of subsistence, meaning they take from the material world and they produce what they need to survive. The way in which men produce their means of subsistence depends on the actual means of subsistence they find in existence. So just like a bird, the bird is only going to make its nest out of the twigs, right? It's not going to suddenly have plastic to make but it has the twigs itself. And as individuals express life, so they are. And the expression of life is through the production and the creations that they make. Here, the whole character of a species, its generic character is contained in its manner of vital activity. And free conscious activity is the species characteristic of man, okay? Free conscious activity is what it means to be human. Um, and by conscious and by free, he's really talking about being able to be creative and produce whatever it is that you want, okay? So that's important for Marx, is the free conscious activity. So let me return back to PowerPoint. Okay, so here are just different ways of saying it, and you'll see many theorists like Marx, they often repeat the same idea in like 3 different ways, 4 different ways. So it's really trying to use their language and figure out what's the best way to say it. So to take what is in the world and creatively produce something new. What is interesting for Marx, seeing as he's very in the material world, for us, it might seem kind of mystical how he sees this happen, but for Marx, it's all material. That when you are creating, your essence, your being is put into that labor and into the product that you create, right? So if I make this masterpiece of art, that is a extension of myself because I have put myself into that art. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's what makes what he's about to describe about capitalism so dangerous. So capitalism alienates us from 4 core relationships that we have with the world around us. And by alienation, he means separation. First, it separates us from our labor. If someone's dictating how you work, when you work, what you work, why you work, right? Then this labor is no longer an extension of you. It is something external and something that is, literally laborious, right? It is a job rather than a creative activity that you freely engage in. Remember, we just read that it's free conscious activity. When you are working for someone else, it is no longer free. Second, you become alienated from your product. And he actually sees this as you become slaves to your product. Now, clearly, slave is a loaded term that perhaps he might, living today, use another term. But what he wants to say is that because we have to produce things to survive, that our entire existence is made for the production of those things rather than us being excited and producing things because we love life. It's kind of like the whole cliche, are you working to live or living to work, right? He's saying humans work to live. That's what we like, or live to work. That's who we are. We love working. That's who we are. But capitalism makes us work simply to live. Okay. Third, which is kind of a combination of all of this, is our species being or species essence. That quote I just read about our species characteristics of human being is to be life conscious activity, right? So that's what our species being is, life conscious activity. And when we are employed by other people who dictate how we produce, what we produce, then we are separated from our very essence of what it means to be human, which is one of the most horrifying ideas, right? If you are separated from your human essence, then what are you? And Marx says that all capitalism does is turn us into animals. And that is a problem. And so a lot of ethical philosophers today actually borrow a lot from this idea that capitalism is dehumanizing, that it really just destroys the humanity of every person. And finally, it alienates us from others. When you have an economic system that is based entirely on individuals being tools in a economic machine, then we have no reason really to connect with other people. and the connections we have with other people are reduced to simple economics. Are you of value to my economic productivity? Do you, and this actually has become reignited in scholarship with things like multi-level marketing. And uh, do either of you remember or are familiar with like Tupperware sales or LuLaRoe or things like that, where you find your friends and you try to get your friends to buy products? There's a lot of scholarship that shows that it actually tends to ruin friendships because it does reduce that to an economic activity. And these friends are like, well, are you going to like me if I say no? Right? Like, how does this work now that you've made our friendship dependent on economics? And this is a great example of how capitalism is forcing relationships to be based in economic terms rather than anything more, right? Okay, so the last piece is this move from capitalism to communism. His big quote is, "The history of all hitherto societies is the history of class struggles." Um, Here are the main ideas that you should pull from this. Um, Class struggle, as is intuitively known, is this struggle between those who own the means of production and those who have to sell their labor for that production, right? So that's also the haves. So for Marx, the haves are those who own the means of production. The have-nots are those who do not own. So a lot of times critics of Marx will say, but I have, I have a computer or I have a car or things like that. And when he says own, he really means um, property and land, because that is where you can derive more materials from. Yes, if you have a computer, you're able to create things, but you have a finite amount that you can create from a computer. Whereas if you own 5,000 acres, right, you can do a lot more than that in the material world. Proletariats are the working class. The bourgeoisie are also the capitalists. The pauperization of the proletariat is something that I think we are seeing within the last 3 years to an extreme degree. Um, as we talked about with surplus value and labor value, um, it is capitalists are incentivized to continue reducing the wages of the proletariat. And Marx foresees that this will continue to go until you quote unquote pauperize the proletariat. If you're not familiar, pauper is a term that was often used in Western Europe during the Dark Ages and during like the 1700s, 1800s, to mean someone who is essentially poor and homeless. A pauper is someone who has no money, has no land, has no prospects, has no job. And so what he's saying here is that the capitalists will continue reducing the wages to the point that it will actually dip down below survivable levels. And that they will be laboring, but it's not going to be enough for them to buy food. It's not going to be enough for them to buy water and shelter and whatever. And I personally believe, as we see with COVID, with the economic crisis, that at the same time, the wealthiest in society have seen their profits skyrocket, and we've seen massive economic growth. We've also seen a drastic increase in homelessness, in poverty, right? And so it's really polarizing the few rich and the massive poor. And that is what gets us to where he says the move to communism will be a movement of the majority. It's because you've got these few capitalists who have now made it impossible for the majority of the world to live, right? they are eventually going to get sick of it. And they're going to rise up, take over, and they're going to make private property abolished. Now, this is where we see the difference between Russian and Chinese capital or communism with Marxist communism is that those were both um, movements of minorities. Russian communism and Chinese communism were small communist parties that overthrew and took over the government and enforced communism. Marx wouldn't, he would be like, that's not what I meant. He would say it must be worldwide and it must be of all the people coming together communally and rising up. Um,
Professor,
yeah,
so can I ask you about, you were talking about what's happening today, and I agree
yeah,
with what you were saying. But just over the last, I would say 6 months, there has been reports of massive, like millions and millions of people coming out of the workforce and
yeah.
deciding to do something different. And
Mhm.
I'm wondering if that might be perhaps the beginnings of that as a result of what Marx is talking about, right? Because people are saying they want to have the ability to work from home, they want to be able to do this, they want to be able to do that. And it looks to me
Right.
like the proletariats are saying, well, I don't want to work for you anymore. And they're
Right.
just not doing it.
I definitely think there's part of it. It's hard to say simply because few of these people, even if they're working from home, are exiting the capitalist system, right? They,
Entirely, right. Some are
right,
going off the grid, but not in
sure,
massive numbers.
right.
Yeah.
Most of the people are saying, I don't want to work for you. I'm going to find, a company that values me, or I'm going to freelance, or a lot of them are moving into this gig economy, which is even more precarious than holding a full-time job. So um, it's hard to say. I would also argue that, and this is where Marx doesn't quite get it because he's very focused on Western Europe rather than the world at large, is that a lot of, I mean, the companies are like, okay, quit. I'm going to go to these other countries and get cheaper labor, right? And so um, it might be the start, and I think a lot of, especially in the US, there's a lot of a growth of ethical capitalism, right? Of um, companies that are trying to be ethical in how they treat their workers, but that is still within the capitalist system. I don't know if that helps, John C. I don't know if you're still on or if you had to pause it. Um, okay, but the last thing I'm going to say before we close out and I open it up to any questions you have is Marx says that the weapons of the revolution are inherent in the system. So as I discussed in how it's kind of quote unquote a dog eat dog world, that if you do not produce enough surplus value, you're going to be bought out of other groups. He sees this as this will cause the ironic death of capitalism because you'll have this educated group of bourgeoisie who have read Marx and not just Marx, but understand what a class is, understand how the world works, and eventually they're going to be pushed into the proletariat as well. This educated group of former capitalists. Sorry, my dog found her squirrel squeaker toy. Um, these educated bourgeoisie are going to be pushed into the proletariat. They are going to then instruct the proletariat on what class is and what class consciousness is, and that is going to give the majority the class consciousness, the knowledge, the know-how, and the ability to finally rise up. So the idea that this is where kind of the idea that capitalism will eat itself is that eventually it will run out of other people to push down. And that's why a lot of Marxists will say the weapons of revolution are inherent in the system because eventually um, capitalism will push enough people who are educated and know what's going on into the proletariat. They will help spread the news that we need a massive revolution. And here we go. Now, the best, do you want to say hi, Jeannie? This is Juniper. She is very lonely right now. Um, we're almost done. So, oh, one of the best examples of capitalism, actually, and this gets really nerdy. The show's kind of who I am and what I've watched is Star Trek. Um, Part of Star Trek is that all of the needs of the people have been taken care of, right? So if you've ever watched Star Trek, they go over to the little, I can't remember what it's called, but this little like thing on the wall and they say, I want a, cheeseburger, and this thing creates a cheeseburger and they go off and they, they do the work. Um, and in the idea of Star Trek, each person is doing what they're best at and what they love, right? And there's not really that much of a conflict between who is captain and who's chief engineer, right? Because the chief engineer loves being in the boiler room, he loves making sure the ship works, and he's happy with that and he feels a part of it. The chief security officer is doing his thing, right? And everybody loves their job, and there's no real fight for who becomes on top, because the person who is captain is really just born to be captain. They're really great at it. They love it. That's what they do, right? So a lot of it's a joke among a lot of people, like theorists, about how Marx envisioned Star Trek before, and it's ironic because Gene Roddenberry, whoever produced Star Trek, was a vehement anti-communist. He hated Marx and he was, Red Scare and all that stuff. But it's just ironic that really what he did was created a sci-fi version of communism. Anyways, so that is an attempt to sum up Marx in less than an hour. I open it up to questions, and I'm happy to keep explaining. And feel free, if you need to go, to peace out. But I'll be here until questions are answered.
I just have a question about the test for tomorrow.
Yeah.
How should we study? I mean, should we study based off the notes that you've given us and the readings?
Oh, the quiz?
Yes, the quiz, I'm sorry.
So, let me see if that's showing. So if you go to, let me pull this up real quick. So the quiz is literally those quiz questions from the reading guide. I don't know if you use the reading guide, but it's not showing up. So you'll look in the reading guide and it has those like quiz questions. Those are literally the quiz questions for the quiz. So that's how you should study. You should answer the questions that you have. And it should be available to you now. If it's not, I'm sorry. I don't know why it logged me out.
It is available. I saw it already.
Okay, yeah. So you can go in, and as a reminder, you can take it as many times as you want to get the grade you need.
I'm
so if you're
answering
going
the question. I'm sorry. I was just saying that I'm answering the questions on the reading guide so that when I get to the test, I can just copy and
Yeah.
paste my answers.
Yeah, that's a totally fine way to do it. So just a reminder of how the grading works is that if you're going for an A or a B, then it's only based on completion. So I'm not looking at your quiz scores because I'm going to be grading your other things, and that's more important to me that you're putting your time into those. But if you're going for a C or a D, then the quizzes are how I judge that you know the material, and so I'm expecting a higher grade. So based on what you're going for in the class, then if you're going for an A or B, just take it. Make sure you know what the answers are so that you understand Marx. I definitely am using these quizzes as a learning tool rather than a grading tool, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Any
This
other
was very
questions?
helpful. I
Okay,
don't feel as
Oh my
crazy
gosh,
now.
yes.
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
I was like, whew.
that's why I do them.
Thank
And
you.
so I know, like I said, I know that theory can be tough, but I also find it the most fascinating because it really every time I read Marx, I'm like, well, is it just class? Because I see what he means, you know? And so it really pushes you to think and reevaluate, and that's what I love about it. So um, I'm glad this was helpful. I'll keep doing them. And I'm always happy to chat more about it in office hours if there's anything else you're struggling with or need help on. Okay? Yeah, thank you. Have a good night, you two.
Thank
You too.
you.
Thank you.
Thank
It's
you.
good to meet you, classmate.
It was good to meet you as well.
All right. Bye.
Have a good night.